So from a biological point of view, we are not a monogamous species. That's simply, we can see that by the rate of infidelity, for example. What we have is two sorts of monogamy. You have sexual monogamy and we have social monogamy.
Dr Anna Machin is an evolutionary anthropologist explaining why we love, bond and behave the way we do.
At least 30% of men on dating apps swipe right to every single female they see. So there is no discernment. There's no deciding between anyone. And that means women tend to get a lot of matches. And so we've got this extreme thing where men like everything and women are having to be so ultra choosy. And it's led to people, in a way, seeing it more as a game than something that's actually quite serious.
When a man becomes a father, what happens to his brain?
When you become a father for the first time, your testosterone drops and it can be up to a third. And it doesn't return to pre-fatherhood levels unless you lose contact with your child.
When I see that guy in person, as a woman, am I looking for something specific?
Men and women in heterosexual relationships look for different things. So if you're a woman, we need indicators that you're fertile, which is why men tend to look for body image more than women. The biggest one is the waist-hip ratio. For women, it's a little bit more complicated. What women can do is we can smell genetic compatibility. AI is going to do lots of really great things for lots of people. Where it really, I'm terrified of it treading is in our relationships. Because relationships aren't just about being with people. Relationships are integral to our health.
Dr. Anna, when you study humans falling in love, what is the one thing that most of us get wrong and what is the other thing that we need to pay more attention to?
Ooh, gosh, the one thing you get wrong. I think the one thing we get wrong is understanding that love is I think mainly that love is a really, really complicated thing and that it has lots of different factors that come into it. So it's not really reducible to like one set of chemicals or one particular behavior or one psychological mindset. And there's never going to be a formula for love. And I think sometimes people expect scientists to come up with formulas and give you a predictive answer to things to do with love. And love is really complicated. And that's why I enjoy studying it, because it's so complicated. And it does mean we all have an individual experience of love, which I also think is really special. But I think some people are quite surprised to find out quite how complicated it is.
Can you talk us through, Anna, what happens to the brain when we're in love? Like, does something happen to us?
Absolutely. It's quite complicated. I mean, there's a difference. Love has several stages. And there's a difference between what we call the attraction, lustful stage, if we're talking about romantic love, and actual love. So what you feel at the beginning isn't love. Love is defined by a certain set of chemicals that kind of come later on down the line of your relationship and is defined by things like attachment and stuff like that. So when we're first in love, what happens in our brain is different to what happens in long-term love. So when you first like see somebody that you're attracted to, there are three key chemicals that are involved in that, and they are dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. And they all have a different role to play, either to motivate you to make the effort to actually find a partner, and then to reward you for making that effort, really. And so, like oxytocin, when you see someone across a crowded room and you get that like hit of chemistry that a lot of people talk about, what happens is you've taken in lots and lots of information about them from your senses. So you don't know you're doing it. It's not conscious, but you've taken lots of information about your senses about what they look like, what they sound like, if you're a woman, what they smell like. And that goes through an algorithm in your head, which is very, very complicated, 500,000 years old. And it decides whether or not this person is like a good bet for you, essentially. And if it is, then you get this flood of oxytocin flooding the unconscious bit of your brain, which is the bit right in the middle where emotions are. And oxytocin is brilliant because it kind of lowers your inhibitions to talking to people. It makes you more confident, makes you less shy. And it does that by quietening the fear center of your brain. So oxytocin does that. Dopamine is also released. Dopamine is your hormone of motivation. And it's really important that's released because oxytocin is a really amazing chemical, but it can make you feel so chilled that you wouldn't actually make any effort because you're just like having a lovely time on your own. So dopamine gives you a kick up the bum and goes, right, you've actually got to go and talk to this person now. So those two are released when you first are attracted. And then we have serotonin. And serotonin is interesting because serotonin, whilst oxytocin and dopamine go up, serotonin goes down. So that confused us for a while because serotonin is your happy chemical and you're thinking, well, this should be a happy time. I should be feeling exhilarated about the fact I've found someone I'm attracted to. But actually, serotonin underpins obsessive love. And we know that because people who have obsessive compulsive disorder have low levels of circulating serotonin. It makes you very obsessive. And if you think about when you start a relationship with somebody, they fill your mind space a lot, your head space a lot. You think about them a lot. You look at photos of them. You talk to people endlessly about them. You're constantly daydreaming about what they're up to, what you're going to do. And that's that low serotonin, because we actually need you to be a bit obsessed, because you need to be in like putting all that information into your head, essentially. So that's kind of what happens in your brain when you are attracted. When you actually get to love is more complicated. Love is underpinned by a different chemical called beta endorphin, because oxytocin in particular isn't very powerful. And it doesn't last very long, the effect it has on you. So it can't underpin love that lasts for, years or decades. So we have beta endorphin, which is an opiate. So it's addictive. And that's actually the hormone of long-term love. I know everyone says oxytocin is the love hormone. It's actually not. It's beta endorphin. And different bits of your brain are involved then, particularly your conscious brain. So if you think about when you're in love, you spend a lot of time like thinking about your relationship, contemplating your relationship, the kind of skills we need for long-term love, such as trust and empathy and reciprocity and making conscious attempts to maintain the relationship. That's all your conscious brain. And so love looks very different on like the scanner screen than attraction does, for example.
Okay, so when we meet someone for that first time and we get all those feelings going on, we go and talk to our friends and our family and we say, this is the person that I think I'm interested in. Is there any point having that conversation? Because all of these things are going on in our brain, like you mentioned, and the people around us don't really have any understanding of what we're actually seeing versus what they may be seeing?
Yeah, they don't exactly. And they are actually seeing something very different to you because actually when you are first attracted to somebody, part of your brain, which is actually quite important for judging someone's character, shuts down. So what's really interesting is your friends and your relatives get a really realistic view of that person because that bit of their brain hasn't shut down. And it's actually the bit of the brain we call the mentalizing area of the brain. And it's the bit that you need actually to spot someone who's lying or cheating. So actually when you're first in love or first attracted to somebody, that bit shuts down. So you're actually not very good at spotting people who aren't actually that kind or nice or in fact lying to you, whereas your friends and family can. And this is what I always say to people, is actually in a way you should take on board what your friends and family say because their brain is fully functioning. Your brain isn't. But they will see something different because you've got all those attraction chemicals going on. But it's always worth talking to your friends and family because actually when we've done studies looking at how good your friends and family are at A, judging who's good for you, and B, spotting people who aren't good for you, they're actually quite good at it. They're actually pretty good at it. So it's always worth listening to what your friends and family say.
Anna, are we the only species that love?
No, definitely not. No, we're not. It's really because we don't have a definition of love, an absolute definition of love, because it's very complicated. It's hard to sort of say explicitly this animal loves this way or this way or this way. What we can say is there are some animals that love nearly in the same way we do. The only thing that really separates human love from other animal love, well, there's two things. First of all, they don't have the cultural angle. So if you think part of our love experience is actually sociological and cultural, it's about the rules you have in your society about love, your religion, your politics, the media you've consumed as you were growing up kind of changes how you think love is. Obviously, animals don't have that, and they very unlikely they ever will. The other thing that separates us is we're the only species that uses love to manipulate. No other species does that. So those are the only two things that separate us. And there are certainly some higher order animals, such as the other apes, such as what we call the cetaceans, so whales, dolphins, possibly elephants, experience love like we do. They have really strong attachment relationships. They grieve when they lose a loved one. They have really quite complex social networks, which have friendships and things like that. Particularly in the apes, they have exactly the same neurochemistry that we do. So actually, they probably do experience love like we do. And then the lesser animals, even they have love. If you think about the mammals, all mammals have attachment relationships. So it's really how you want to define love. And I don't think we should really define love by our standards. Say, well, actually, you don't love because you don't love like us. Well, actually, there's an amazing, he's unfortunately not with us anymore, but amazing animal behaviorist called Jaak Panksepp, who used to study love. And what he said was actually what humans have done is they've taken love, which other animals experience. And they've kind of overly embellished it. They've made it really, really complicated because that's kind of what we do. And he said it's a bit like a cupcake. So the actual cake is love. And what we've done is we've just dumped loads and loads of frosting and sprinkles and all that on top. And that's nice, but actually it's not necessary to experience love. And I think that's a good way of putting it. So no, we absolutely are not the only species who has love.
Does sexual attraction decline over time?
It really depends on the person, actually. For most people, yes, because if you think about long-term relationships, there is an attraction stage, and that's when it's very, very lustful. And we kind of call that passionate love, if we're going to give it a love term. And then that over time disappears into companionate love. And companionate love, whilst there's still that sexual element there, it's much less of a driver. So for most people, there will be a period of time where you start to see that tailing off. But there's no real timetable. People always say to me, okay, so how long into the relationship does that happen? Well, it really is an individual thing. For example, some people have a much higher sex drive than other people. Some people, psychologically need sex more than other people. Some people, actually have huge passionate sexual attraction for years and years and years and years. So there's no real timetable. But we would generally see, yes, a tailing off of that happening as companionate love becomes more of the thing. And companionate love isn't as lustful, but it's a much tighter bond and it's a much deeper bond than passionate love is.
Anna, how has technology changed the way we love or our attachments? Because I've got a friend who uses all the apps. It's almost like a game for her. I think we counted in a week that she matched with about 2,000 people. Like, it was crazy. Something insane like that. Yeah. Now, she obviously didn't go and meet all these people, but she treats it like a game. So, I mean, I've never been on a dating app, so I have never had that experience, but I could imagine that it's changed us in a way.
It has changed us behaviourally, certainly. It hasn't changed any of the neurochemistry or any of the actual brain structure or any of the ways, in fact, we choose partners. And that's part of the problem, is unfortunately a lot of dating apps have been designed without any thought about how the human brain actually works how we choose somebody. And they've done it in very, very crude ways, like so they match people based on, geographic area, or they'll match people on very basic similarities, like, oh, I like dogs, you like dogs, therefore you'll get on, which is just no. So partly they haven't been designed in the correct way. And what has happened is it has become very gamified. And that's partly because of the way people use them. And I don't necessarily think the people who invented sort of the really big legacy apps, as we would call them, so the Tinders, the Bumbles, the Hingers, I don't think they necessarily designed them thinking this would happen. But what's happened is we've got a thing happening on the dating apps known as extreme mate choice. And what's happened there is we've got men, there's at least 30% of most men on dating apps swipe right to every single female they see. So there is no discernment, there's no deciding between anyone. And that means women tend to get a lot of matches. Like your friend got 2,000 matches. I mean, that is insane. There is no way you can process 2,000 matches and have really any chance of landing on the one that's actually going to be right for you. And so we've got this extreme thing where men like everything and women are having to be so ultra choosy, because otherwise they end up with thousands and thousands of matches. So we've got this kind of gamification going on. And we've also got people, obviously, who are dating lots of people at once, because you can do that because there's so many options. And it's led to people, in a way, seeing it more as a game than something that's actually quite serious. And because it's very cheap in terms of time and in terms of effort just to sit there going like this, people don't commit in the same way. In the old days, when I met my husband, you were going to go on a date with somebody. You were going to go on a date with them in person, so you made lots of effort. You were going to spend a reasonable period of time. It was probably going to cost you some money. You got really nervous, Whereas now you can literally date lots of people at once because you're just going to chat to them all on WhatsApp or whatever. You don't really have to make any particular investment of time, and you don't really have to commit to anyone. If in the old days, the idea of, having to talk to 20 people at once, you'd have to go on 20 dates, and people are like, I'm not going to do that. Whereas now you can. So it's kind of really skewed how we view dating and how we choose who we go on a date with. And in fact, I've recently, and for a really long time, I got approached by a lot of dating app companies and said, I'm sorry, I don't want to work with you because they'd taken so little consideration of actually how humans date. And therefore they weren't giving the users the best chance of finding somebody because they were doing such crude matching techniques. It was like, this is not supported by any human behavior. Whereas I've actually just signed up with a new dating app called LoveJack because we are doing it from scientific principles. And we're hoping that because of that, we will actually be an app that, first of all, can't be gamified. And secondly, is really actually for people who want to find love. You know, a lot of dating apps are actually scared of the love word. They say connection. And actually, a lot of people want to find love. So why are we running away from that? And so that's the idea behind our app, is because things like the very visually based apps, the ones where you just get an image, unfortunately, they're biased towards the way men pick dates. And they're also biased towards short-term hookups, because in long-term relationships, looks are less important. So actually, they end up becoming hookup apps because that's all the information you're giving somebody. So it's changed the way we behave when we're dating, but it actually hasn't changed what we really want to find, and it hasn't changed how our brain actually finds them.
Okay, so if someone's watching this right now and they're in the dating scene, and maybe they are on these apps, one of the things that I always hear from people that are on the apps is that they can't even be bothered with the conversations that go on the apps. They either want to get to the point where they meet someone quickly, get off the app as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So if they are on an app, what are some great questions to ask rather than, do you have a dog or what's your favourite food?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I would kind of give away what our app's about. And what we do on our app is actually, we just say, so the way you sign up is you actually sign up by saying, just give us 5 words that describe how you feel today.
Okay.
Just 5 words. And usually one of those words is really interesting. Like it'll be something really, really left field. And that starts a conversation because you're like, oh, why did you put that? And then they'll go, oh, well, I put that because of this, 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 and this. Like there's one guy, I think one of his words was disco.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like, why did you put disco? And he's like, oh, well, actually, I did my PhD thesis on discos in the 70s or something. And then you start kind of having a conversation about that. So it's try to put something down there that really shows your personality. And don't start with the usual, and how are you today? Well, fine. That's not going to give you any information about that person.
Yeah.
You know, even just a question like, what did you have for breakfast today? Just something a bit more interesting that feeds in. Because actually, when you're looking for love, ultimately what you fall in love with is someone's brain, their mind. The looks are important, but they're definitely not the primary thing. And actually what's important is, someone's creativity, whether they're witty, whether they're clever, whether they, I don't know, whether they have the same values as you, what's their personality. And that's what you need to express, is actually who are you? Not necessarily what you look like. And that's the problem with sort of visual apps. And then that chatting bit is people find it very hard to do that chatting bit and actually get any really helpful information out of it. And then obviously you've also got the people on the apps who actually, unfortunately, there are some people there who have absolutely no intention of actually meeting you. We get some people who literally never meet anyone. And so you're having these endless conversations which are not going to go anywhere. And that's quite demoralising, I think.
I think it's also quite scary now as well with the apps that there could be someone that's chatting with you, but you're really chatting with ChatGPT because they're just putting in these, little poems and whatever they want to do.
Absolutely.
And they're smashing out all these, amazing things. And then it's not even who that person is.
And that's terrifying.
That's
exactly.
terrifying.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why I completely agree with you, is that actually you want to get off the app as quickly as possible. We shouldn't really see them as dating apps. What we should see them as is introduction apps. So they introduce you to somebody, but you're not supposed to date them on the app. You're supposed to go out and meet them somewhere. Obviously we all want it to be safe and we want to make sure that it's a good, but at the same time, the longer you spend chatting, the further away you're actually getting about learning anything about this person. And also you're really handicapping your brain. Your brain is there to help you. But the only way it can help you is if you are in person. You're not going to get that oxytocin, dopamine that's going to help you feel motivated, help you feel calm, help you feel confident when you're on the app. You don't get any neurochemistry when you're on the app. You only get that if you're in person. So, it's really handicapping your brain and making it harder for yourself if you stay on the app.
Yeah. Okay, say I've met somebody on the app, but we're going to go meet in person. When I see that guy in person, as a woman, am I looking for something specific? Does a woman's brain work differently? And what's he looking for so that we can see if we're compatible?
Yeah, okay. So again, it's all unconscious. You don't necessarily know you're doing it. But yes, men and women in heterosexual relationships look for different things because ultimately what evolution wants you to do, whether you want to or not, what we've evolved to look for is a reproductive mate. And obviously, men and women bring different things to the reproductive party. So if you're a woman, you bring basically your fertility and your womb. That's what you bring, and your health. And if you're a man, I'm afraid, like, sperm isn't very costly, so we're not interested in that. What we're interested in is your ability to protect and provide and really kind of how good your genes are. And so the indicators of those, like visually, are different depending on whether you're a man or a woman. So if you're a woman, we need indicators that you're fertile, that you're young, and that you're healthy. That's what we need. And those are all seen in body image, essentially, which is why men tend to look for body image more than women. And the biggest one is the waist-hip ratio. And the waist-hip ratio is a really good predictor of first of all, it's a really good predictor of fertility. So the ideal waist-hip ratio cross-culturally is 0.7. So that's kind of actually your classic hourglass figure. And the reason why it's cross-culturally attractive is because it has a direct relationship to fertility. So if you have a 0.7, you're usually highly fertile. You're obviously a long way from menopause. When you would be closer to a 1, your waist would thicken. It's also linked to lots of diseases. So if you have a 0.7, you have lower risk of diabetes, lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of certain renal conditions, lower risk of certain cancers. So you're a good bet. You're fertile and you're healthy and you're young. You're not near menopause. Great. And that's why, and that 0.7 is what men are assessing. They don't know they're necessarily doing it, but it's the first thing that they see. There's been a wonderful an eye tracking experiment done where they made men wear eye tracking, glasses. They didn't tell them what they wanted. They just said, just walk down the street. Walk down the street. And they tracked what they looked at with the women coming towards them. And the first thing they look at is the waist and the hips. And they don't know they're doing it, but the brain is calculating it, going, okay, is this a good, ratio? So that's why men tend to promote looks above other things, particularly in short-term relationships, because it's a visual indicator. For women, it's a little bit more complicated. Looks come into it, certainly. There is a shoulder-waist ratio, which is 1.6, which is like that classic, like really broad shoulders, narrow waist. The one thing I will say is whilst quite a lot of the normal population of women will have a 0.7, not many men in the normal population will have a 1.6. It's actually kind of like a rower's body who's an Olympian, that kind of. But it's attractive because it's obviously you're athletically fit. You're healthy, therefore you can protect, and that's why that. But it's kind of less important. What we're looking for is evidence that you can protect and provide. And so things like let's look for indicators of the ability to provision. So it might be what the guy is wearing, what watch is he wearing, what kind of job's he talking about, that kind of thing. Can he provision? And that's kind of what we're looking at in men. And then whether you're a man or a woman, you will look for evidence that they have strong genes, because obviously your kid is going to inherit those. And that's all down to facial symmetry. So you want somebody who's as close to symmetry in their face as possible, because symmetry in the face is indicative of healthy genes, because our genes want to make us symmetrical. And over the time when we're developing, particularly in the womb, they get knocked off course by various stresses in the womb. So if you're close to symmetry, it kind of shows that you went through all those stresses, but you still managed to get pretty good close to symmetry. Therefore, your genes must be really strong, and therefore this person is attractive. And it's really interesting. We always find people who are close to symmetry attractive. So like someone like Brad Pitt, for example, is very close to symmetry.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's really fascinating. I have heard you speak about another thing that women do that I want to pick your brain about.
Yeah.
We can smell a compatible partner. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's one particular aspect of compatibility, and that's genetic compatibility. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you really, really need to avoid when you're looking for a reproductive mate is that you choose someone who's too genetically close to you, because that might result in inbreeding, and obviously that has an impact on the viability of your offspring. So you don't want to do that. And so what women can do is we can smell genetic compatibility. And again, it's not something conscious. So it's not like you go up to someone and think, oh my God, they smell amazing. But you know how sometimes you might meet a guy and everything about them seems great. You know, they're good looking, their conversation's amazing, but there's just something about it where you just go, ooh. And it's probably that they're too genetically close to you and you can smell that. And the reason why is because the set of genes that underpins our ability to smell also underpins part of our immune system response. It's known as the major histocompatibility complex, and it underpins your immune response. And you want to end up with someone whose MHC complex is as far away from yours as possible. Mm-hmm. So we actually smell that, how close it is. And if it's too close, and therefore we're too close to being inbred, we won't like the smell of that man. Whereas if it's far enough away, we will find him attractive, because you want your child to have as diverse an immune response as possible. And women can do it. And for a really long time, we had to test it sort of in a really roundabouty kind of way by getting men to wear T-shirts and then getting women to smell them. And then, you know, the one she liked the smell of the most was the one that was genetically most, you know, extreme away from her. Now we just test for it genetically. But it works. And we think men can't do it either because they've never been able to do it, or because they've lost the ability over evolutionary time. And we think that might be because for women, the consequence of mating with someone who's too genetically close to you is really quite big, because you will have a baby who is maybe too, you know, reasonably inbred. It might have lots of health issues. And that's going to be really impactful on you as a woman, because you've got to carry it for 9 months. You've then got to feed it. Whereas for a man, the consequences aren't as big. So we think maybe that's why women can do it and men can't.
So when a man becomes a father, what happens to his brain?
Oh, wow. So what happens to his brain? His brain changes quite fundamentally, and his brain changes pretty much the same as a woman's brain does, which is why we say that the men are actually as prepared to parent biologically as women are. So your brain goes through changes. It has increases in grey and white matter in areas of the brain which are really key for parenting. And what that means is that the brain becomes more connected in those areas. It becomes more efficient, becomes more skilled at doing whatever the skill is. So if we look in the core of the brain where your emotions and like nurturing and attachment are, you see an increase in grey and white matter in that area of the brain. So you increase your nurturing skills and your motivation to want to nurture. And then when we look at the outer areas of the brain, the cortex, which is where your conscious brain sits and where all the kind of like really quite complex cognitive skills are, we see increases in areas like empathy. So empathy is the ability to read your child's emotional state and then meet that state appropriately. And things like planning and problem solving and attention, areas that are really important for parenting, also increase in size. So the brain fundamentally changes and rewires in quite a drastic way. And it does it after birth, so it does it through interaction. So we usually look at the brain about 6 weeks after birth, and you will see the changes there. And the more you interact with your child, the more hands-on you are caring for your child, the bigger those changes will be, the more drastic and significant they will be. So it's really, really striking. And actually, it is paralleled by... So we've known women's brains change for about 20 years, but we now know that men's brains change in practically the same way.
So what happens to a kid, a son, when the father isn't there in the relationship?
So if a son doesn't have a father, so no father figure at all, so it doesn't have to be a biological father, but no father figure at all, then we do know the outcomes for actually boys and girls without fathers are quite significant and quite significantly negative, unfortunately. We've just had 2 really big reports here in the UK looking at the outcomes for children who don't have father figures in their lives. And there are a lot of issues around increased risk behaviours. So things like, risky sexual behaviours, smoking, addiction, alcohol, things like that. We know that there are issues with antisocial behaviour. So one of the key roles a father has in terms of child development is he is actually the parent who underpins a lot of the aspects of social development. So things like social language, pro-social skills like sharing, caring, helping, emotional regulation, behavioural inhibition, all of these things that you need to be able to do to be like successful as a social being is underpinned by dad. So kids who don't have that input, we tend to have increased risk of antisocial behaviour, increased risk of criminality. We tend to see a reduced educational outcomes because, again, dads underpin, they don't necessarily underpin academic success, but they underpin appropriate learning behaviour. And so kids who haven't had that role model tend to not have appropriate learning behaviour in school. So their educational outcomes aren't as great. And children who don't have father figures also tend to have poorer mental health because, again, fathers are the parent of resilience. They build mental resilience in their children. And if you don't have that input kind of throughout your life, then you're much more likely to have poor mental health. So the outcomes for children who don't have that input are quite drastic. What we do say is it doesn't have to be the biological father. So one thing we make very clear when we talk about fathers is we don't mean that you are necessarily involved in conception. In many cultures around the world, actually, children have social fathers. It's not something we're really aware of in the West, but a lot of cultures have social fathers. So it might be actually the father figure is an uncle or a grandfather, an elder brother or a friend of the family, or even like a football coach or just somebody who is that male role model in that child's life. And that's what we say is a child needs somebody. It can be a biological father, it can be a social father, but they need somebody because human children have evolved to have both female and male input, and they need both because the mum's role and the dad's role are different. And if one of them is missing, then the child doesn't have the total developmental environment. So it is really tricky. And we're always aware of single parent families. But actually, when we work with single parent families, quite often they will say there is no father because there's no biological father. But actually, quite often the child does have male figures in their life who are really important to that child, who actually are fulfilling that role.
What about in same-sex relationships then, Anna?
Yeah.
How does that work? Because I guess, does the brain shift or what happens there?
Yeah, so the brain does shift to a certain extent. So if we look at heterosexual couples, let's say we put them in a scanner and we ask them to interact with their child. If you're a heterosexual couple, different bits of your brain light up in terms of the peak activation. So the bit that's the most intensely active differs depending on whether you're a mum or a dad. So if you're a mum and you're interacting with your child, it's the core of the brain where nurturing sits, which is really lighting up really, really strongly. If you're a dad and you're interacting with your child, it's actually the neocortex, the cortical area of the brain, which is where all that social cognition is, because you're going to underpin all the social stuff. And that's what we see. And we see this difference. And the idea is that the heterosexual couple, they kind of fit together like jigsaw puzzles. So they don't mirror exactly what each other done. They kind of complement. And together, they will bring the whole developmental environment. Obviously, for example, I study gay fathers. And what happens in gay fatherhood is actually the primary caretaking gay father, the one who's kind of at home and doing most of that care. We see something really interesting happening in their brain. They have two areas of peak activation. They have the one which we would expect for a father, which is in the neocortex, but they also have the mum's one in the nurturing area of the brain. And then there's a new neuronal connection between the two, which allows them to communicate. And that's amazing. But that kind of shows the huge plasticity of the human brain.
Yeah.
It's really open to experience. It changes because of experience. But also, it also shows really how important and difficult human children are to raise, that we actually have to go through a brain change to be able to raise them. Also, what tends to happen in a lot of gay or lesbian couples is, again, there might not be the biological mother, the biological father there, but again, those couples tend to have role models of the opposite sex around them. So I've recently been working with some gay dads, and they are all really aware of wanting their children to have a female input. And it might be one of their mums, it might be one of their sisters. You know, I was speaking to a couple the other day whose kid has 5 godmothers.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Because we are aware that, you know, this is a different kind of input and we need that there as well. And that's all a child needs. They don't need to co-reside with that other sex. It's not necessary, but they do need to have that input.
Let's talk about falling out of love. Is this something that happens quite suddenly in a relationship, or does it happen over a long period of time? How does it usually work?
It kind of really depends, I think, on the person. Obviously, if you're dumped, it happens really quickly. You have no idea it's going to happen. Mostly what happens in long-term relationships is people, generally something, for example, starts to jar in terms of conversation, or in terms of they start irritating you, or you start having more arguments. Whatever generally happens is you start to physically withdraw as well. So you're having too many conflicts, or there's something going on that's irritating you, or whatever it might be. This person is you're no longer rubbing along well in terms of sort of like psychology and cognitive things like discussions. And the first thing we do is we physically withdraw. We spend less time touching them. We spend less time in physical contact with them. And even though we're terribly, terribly clever, we are just a mammal. And the way we ultimately maintain our relationships is through touch. But if you are not getting on with someone, the first thing that goes is touch. And because long-term relationships are underpinned by beta endorphin, which is an opiate, and it's released really strongly by touch. And the way it works to keep you together is really simple. You're with the person, you get a hit of opiate, you feel amazing, you feel euphoric and warm and calm. And then when you go away from them, you kind of go into opiate withdrawal, and that draws you back to them, to the site of where you got your opiate hit. So that's how it works. It's really simple mechanism. But if they start irritating you, you start touching them less, you get less beta endorphin, and you start to kind of slowly withdraw, like you're in a drug withdrawal program. And you get less and less and less. And eventually you get to the point where there's so little beta endorphin being released that it's just not powerful enough to bond you anymore. And that's what happens physiologically. And then we generally also have like the psychological withdrawal. So you start to like spend less time with you spend less time talking to them. The conversations you do have are not nurturing. They're not nice conversations. So you start to become more and more silent with each other. And so it's just this very gradual withdrawal and this very gradual drop of this very addictive chemical in your circulation. And eventually it will just peter out. Now, obviously, if you're dumped, that happens really quickly because your partner might have known for quite a long time, I'm not actually in this relationship anymore, but they take a bit of time to tell you. But if you're dumped, you go from like a really high level of beta endorphin to nothing really hard. And that's like cold turkey. You go completely cold turkey. And that's why being dumped is so painful. Because you're going from a very high level of an opiate, which opiates are a painkiller. So they mask all your physical pain, but also your psychological pain, your emotional pain. You've got used to this lovely euphoric feeling and suddenly it's gone. And your body is in withdrawal. It's physiologically yearning a hit of the beta endorphin. So you're going through all those withdrawal addiction feelings. And that's why being dumped is psychologically and actually physically painful. Because you suddenly don't have this background of this drug anymore.
You know, I'm going through. I've just been through a divorce this year, and my ex and I, we still live in the same suburb, and we haven't seen each other for about 4 months. This happened yesterday, and we were out doing our routines and doing our walk and run and all that kind of thing, and we bumped into each other, and we hadn't seen each other for that long period of time, but going back to that touch thing you were talking about before, obviously we've been through a divorce, things didn't work out, but that moment yesterday that we had, we kept hugging each other, like we kept wanting to re-hug each other. We hugged each other about 5 or 6 times and we started laughing about the fact that we kept hugging each other. And now just you saying that makes it make sense to me with that clearly we've disconnected, but that touching thing was something that we really like doing. But it's like a natural behaviour. But it's a behaviour you're drawn to. Yeah, but it left the relationship for probably the last 18 months. But then it quickly came back in that moment. Yeah, which is strange. It's weird, isn't it? Yeah. And also the other thing is, I mean, I don't know how contentious your divorce was, how conflictual it was, but quite often... No, pretty good. Pretty okay. Yeah, we might fall out of romantic love with someone, but it doesn't mean we don't harbour maybe an element of platonic love for them still. Definitely, yeah. Love for them is sort of like just because you have history or, between you. And so you can kind of segue a little bit into more of a platonic friendship love. Yes. Not that you're going to spend all your time together, but it doesn't mean love's disappeared completely because, love can flip from one form of love to another form of love. Right. Quite easily. Mm. Do men and women experience heartbreak differently then? No. Not at all. It's an absolute... Any sex differences to do with love, heartbreak, breaking up, how you feel when you're in love, what happens in your brain when you're in love. There's no sex differences. It's a myth, unfortunately. Yeah, it's not a very helpful myth, particularly, I think, for men because they've kind of been tarred with the brush of they're like... illiterate when it comes to love and they don't express emotions the same way and actually they do. The problem we have with men is a lot of our cultures, it's not acceptable to express love. So any difference they're showing is more a cultural imposition than anything to do with biology. So if you put somebody in a scan and you don't tell me, what sex they are, I couldn't tell you. By the activation in their brain when they're in romantic love. You just can't tell. There are more individual differences within a sex than there are between the sexes. So, within a sex, you'll get, like women who are, fall passionate in love all the time, women who are actually dismissing, avoidant and never fall in love. Some people are incredibly emotionally literate. Some people are emotionally illiterate.
that there's more difference within the sexes than there is between the sexes.
Mm-hmm. Anna, you've dedicated so much of your life to the research around love and why fathers are so important. Is there a reason why you wanted to focus on those topics?
There's a reason why I focused on fathers, very much so. I started researching fathers 18 years ago, and I researched fathers. I was actually at Oxford studying love. I was brought on board to study close, intimate relationships. So I was studying romantic love. I'd kind of just started studying friendship. And then I went on maternity leave. I had my first child. And unfortunately, it wasn't the best experience in terms of the childbirth. And I was like really ill during childbirth, and my daughter was ill, and I nearly died, and so did she. And actually, the reason why I started studying fathers was because of the way my husband was treated. Because we'd gone into it like a lot of people, you know, we'd decided to have a kid together, we'd gone to the antenatal classes, we'd taken the test together, we were really excited. This is us as a team. And then we went into hospital, all this awful thing happened, and he was just like discarded. And he kind of watched a car crash in slow motion. I was offered loads of therapy. He was offered nothing. He actually had PTSD afterwards. He couldn't talk about the birth without getting really emotional. He couldn't go near the hospital. He was dreading that I might say, let's have another kid, because he was like, I cannot do that again. Nobody offered him anything. When I was really ill and they'd kind of knocked me out, you know, put with morphine and stuff like that, and they'd rushed my baby off to the intensive care. They left him in the room on his own. No one had told him what had happened. And the cleaner came in and said, sorry, I just got to clean up the room. And he said to the cleaner, do you think she's dead? Because I was breathing really shallow. Wow. He couldn't hear me breathing. And the cleaner said, I don't think so, mate. I think they would have told you if she was dead. And he was like, but that was the situation he was left in. And I was really angry. I was really cross that he'd been left in this situation, because I was like, but he also became a parent in that room. And why is nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to see that he's even vaguely significant. And so when I went back to work, I thought, I'm just going to look at what we've done to look at what happens to men. What is the experience of men when they become parents? And there was loads of stuff on absent fathers and the impact they had, which is obviously important. But actually, we know from the data, the vast majority of men, even if they don't live with their children, are in contact with their children. They stick around. And we don't know anything about those men who actually step up and do the job and do it really well. And it's like, why have we not? But they're a really important part of our society. I'm an anthropologist and we don't know anything about them. So that's why I started studying fathers, because I was just so horrified that we hadn't even bothered to ask any questions about them. And there were all these myths, you know, and that's why I did it.
Has that changed now? Is that evolving? Or where's that at now?
It is evolving. It is evolving. And that's partly because we've busted a lot of the myths we have about fathers. So like you asked about the brain changes, you know, it was felt that men were completely unchanged by being parents. Mums were instinctive parents. Fathers, you know, had to learn everything, and they were a bit crap at it, to be honest. And actually what we found is men go through exactly the same brain changes, parallel hormone changes. They are just as instinctive as mums are. So we kind of bashed that one on the head. Also, when I started, it wasn't felt that the love a father had for his child was as strong as the love a mother had. So a mother had an attachment relationship, a father didn't. And again, we've disproved that fathers have attachment relationships, and actually it's a really significant attachment relationship because it's different from the one mum has, and that's developmentally important. And then finally, they were thought to have no role in child development. So mums were the ones who had all the important input into how a child develops. Dads had nothing. And actually, again, that's completely wrong. So we've kind of managed to disprove that. It's getting better. I think men are being less ignored than they used to be. I think men are starting to be recognised as being a really important, not secondary parent, but co-parent. But we've got a long way to go because it's about spreading the knowledge. It's about overturning cultural stereotypes we have about men as fathers that are, you know, decades, centuries old. And that's really hard. And I still get fathers who come to me about their experiences during pregnancy and birth, where things like they're excluded from the room, they're told to stand outside, they're told they're getting in the way, and all of these experiences. So there's still stuff that has to change. But I think as long as we keep working to get the information out there, I think people's attitudes are starting to change. And that's only for the good, actually, ultimately for the family, for the kids in the family, but also for our society, because dads have a major input into the future adults in our society. And we know now from these reports where dads don't have the input, the impact that has on those kids, and then the impact ultimately that will have on our society. So it is changing, but it's really slow. And, you know, those of us, I've been doing it for nearly 20 years. And sometimes it feels a little bit like you're hitting your head against a brick wall.
Yeah.
Anna, you mentioned before the hormonal changes that happen in both men and women, but specifically in men, my brother has just had his first child, and I've noticed such a huge change. Like, he was like this big burly guy, and now he's this like soft mushy thing. And it's really strange to witness someone you know so well change on a biological level almost.
Yeah, and he really, really has.
Yeah. What's going on with him now?
So the biggest thing, and probably the thing that's impacted him the most, and he can probably feel it, is the drop in testosterone that happens when you become a father.
Okay, yeah.
So when you become a father for the first time, your testosterone drops, and it can be up to a third. And it doesn't return to pre-fatherhood levels unless you lose contact with your child. So you don't necessarily have to live with your child, but you have to have contact. And the reason why it goes is really important that it goes is because testosterone is like the hormone of dating, of mating. It's a hormone that makes men really competitive with other men to find a mate. And it's the hormone that makes them more attractive to women if they're in a heterosexual relationship. So it's really important for the dating game. But once you have a kid, we need you to kind of like shift your attention from that to family and committing to that family and helping to raise that child. And so the testosterone goes. And it's not unusual. It happens in all animals that have investing fathers. The thing about us that's unusual is actually not many mammals have investing fathers. So we're quite rare to have them. So yes, his testosterone will have dropped. But what that will have done for him is, first of all, it will have increased his empathy. So he will have become more empathetic, more emotionally aware. So a lot of new fathers find themselves crying at stuff they've never cried at before, or finding stuff upsetting that they never found upsetting before. But he will have become much more empathetic and tuned into his baby. Mm-hmm. He will be much more motivated to nurture, because it does that as well. And also, high testosterone blocks the efficacy of the bonding hormones. So the higher your testosterone, the harder it is for those bonding hormones to express themselves in you. So again, by dropping it, all your bonding hormones get this amazing surge. And that means that he's going to have built a really tight bond, not only with his baby, but also, you know, if he's with the mum of his baby, again, a really tight bond with her. So it's a really quite fundamental change, both in how he's going to feel, how he's going to behave, all controlled by this drop in testosterone. And then there's lots of other, you know, increases. So there's an increase in a hormone called prolactin, which is a parenting hormone, which he will have had, and a big increase in oxytocin, which he will have actually started during pregnancy, alongside his partner. You know, lots of other hormones whizzing around that have gone up and down, and they're all done to make him as primed as he can be to be good at this, to be a really good dad.
It's, as you're describing all of these different things that we go through, I'm realizing more and more that there's like these switches that are going on and off in us all the time. Like, we've got to turn this switch on right now because we're dating. Now we've got to turn this one off and turn this one on. It's really fascinating to see that we're doing this all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, what's interesting with men is when you first start, so let's say you're dating high testosterone, when you actually start a long-term relationship, you get a drop in testosterone. Because again, we need you to stop dating. We need you to invest in this like pair bond you've started developing. And then if you have a kid, it would drop again. So yeah, all of these things are going on all the time. And yeah, we're just not aware of them happening.
Do men want to spread their seed? Is that something that they want to do all the time? Is that something that we'd
No.
Right.
That's something that's, you will basically, again, that's more an individual difference. So some men are very highly sexed, and they are more likely to want to spread, you know, to have multiple partners. Some people, and it's down to lots of different things. It might be down partly to genetics. So some people are genetically predisposed to be happier and want to settle down with one person, whereas other people aren't. And that's men and women. That's partly under genetic control. Also, your upbringing will influence how likely you are to want to commit to one person, or whether or not you want to have lots of different people. Some of it's hormonal. So, you know, with people, for example, who may be polyamorous, we're starting to explore whether there's any hormonal difference as to why people are polyamorous or have open relationships. So it's quite a complicated picture as to why some people are more promiscuous than others. But it's certainly not something that's necessarily more male than female. It's more down to individual difference. if we lived in the sort of environment where we didn't have what we call pair bonding, and we have to have pair bonding for a certain period of time to raise our children because they're really, really difficult. If we look at our ape cousins, like the chimpanzees, they don't have pair bonding. They have multi-male, multi-female groups. And yeah, the males will just literally mate constantly. Whenever there's a female in season, they will mate. But that's because they don't have male investment in offspring. The males have no input into raising the offspring. Because we have input, we have male input. We have evolved to become less promiscuous because the man, for a start, needs to know that the child he's raising is his, because he's going to take himself off the dating game, so lose out on all those possible matings and focus on this one. So over time, we've evolved to be less promiscuous from that point of view and actually focus on this one particular offspring, to know actually that it's our offspring and that we are inputting into it. If we were like the other apes, then we'd just be promiscuous like they are.
So what gives a kid commitment issues? Like what is it that...
There are loads of different things that give someone commitment issues. It can be things like upbringing. So did you have an insecure attachment to your parents? If you had an insecure attachment to your parents, you're more likely to struggle with relationships when you're older. You're more likely to be one of the either anxious or avoidant attachment styles. So that might have an input. Again, it could be down to genetics. It could be that you are just less genetically predisposed to be happy and satisfied in pair bonds, in couples, and you're more likely to sort of want to, have lots of different relationships. There are some people who find the starting bit of a relationship really exciting. So, the attraction, passion, dopamine, oxytocin bit, brilliant. Get to the other bit, the companionate bit, they just get bored. That's just like, this is boring, I don't like it. So they will never get past that bit. They will always, so they'll have lots of relationships, but they're quite short. So there's lots of different reasons why people will do that. It could be that the example you were given by your parents was one where fidelity wasn't a thing. Certainly that can be a thing, that you grew up in a household where neither of your parents were faithful. It could be that you grew up in a society where being faithful isn't particularly, praised or needed. So there's lots of different inputs as to why you might end up being like that. There have been some studies that they're not terribly powerful, so we couldn't say this definitely is. There have been some studies that say there's a possibility you could be genetically predisposed to be more likely to be unfaithful. But those studies are still quite weak at the moment. So whether or not there is a genetic propensity to be unfaithful, we're not quite sure yet. But it's a really complex jigsaw. Nothing with humans is straightforward. There's always so many different bits that will influence whether or not you behave a certain way.
Anna, let's talk about, you mentioned polyamorous relationships and monogamy. Can you talk us through those? Are we supposed to be monogamous in all relationships, I guess?
Oh, I always get into such hot water with this question. What you have to understand about humans is we are what's known as a biocultural species. So most species, there's only one driver of their behaviour, biology. We are driven by our biology and also by our culture. So you can have your biology telling you to do one thing, but your culture, like the rules your society has, the rules your family have, whatever, which are really powerful, might overpower that. So from a biological point of view, we are not a monogamous species. That's simply, we can see that by the rate of infidelity, for example. The fact we have so much infidelity, there's no way from a biological point of view, we would define us as a monogamous species. And from an evolutionary point of view, we're not monogamous. It just doesn't make sense for us to be monogamous. So even if we pair bond to raise our children, actually, from a biological point of view, it would be a really silly thing for you to completely say, I'm never ever going to try and have a sneaky, shag or whatever with somebody else, particularly if you're male, because you could spread your seed a little bit and not have to input into that kid, but you've got some extra genes out there somewhere. If you're female, you could have a really lovely partner who's brilliant as a dad, but actually whose genes are a bit rubbish. And therefore, let's go and mate with somebody else, get his genes and have the lovely daddy bit from this guy. And from a very basic, bald evolutionary point of view, that's a good tactic. However, so that our biology isn't monogamous. And actually, there are very few really, truly monogamous species in the world. What we have is two sorts of monogamy. You have sexual monogamy, which is, yes, I don't have sex with anybody else. And we have social monogamy, which is we appear to be a pair bond, but we're not necessarily sexually monogamous. And that's what most species, including all those classics like penguins, swans, whatever, they're not monogamous. They're socially monogamous. They live together, but they're not sexually monogamous. And that's what we are. But culturally, there are many societies which are monogamous. And there are lots of rules about monogamy, you know, religious rules, legal rules, you know, bigamy is marrying two people at once, for example, that's illegal. The grounds for divorce in many cultures is infidelity. So socially, we are told we're a monogamous species, and those are really powerful rules. And quite often they will overpower because we're group living. If there is a risk you will be thrown out of the group, if you follow your biological urge, then quite often you will temper that and go, no, I'm going to stay in the group because actually the group is safe. And particularly in the past, if you think how recently we've become much more liberal about divorce and about these things, but in the past, even 100 years ago, divorce was a major shame. You did not get divorced. And so they're very powerful. So I often get people saying to me, but I love being monogamous. That's great. I'm really glad you love being monogamous because that's wonderful because it is a spectrum. Some people find monogamy really comfortable. Some people find it really restrictive. There are no rules here, but we are culturally, in many societies, yes, a monogamous species because that's what we've been brought up with. That's what the whole of society is modelled around. And that's also where we feel comfortable. Because as I've said, some people are genetically predisposed to like to be in a couple. And that's fine. So it's not that monogamy is wrong. It's just biologically we aren't driven necessarily to be monogamous. But culturally, yeah, a lot of us are.
That's so interesting when you say 100 years ago, divorce was like, you know, completely taboo. Right now, it kind of feels like, okay, it's all good. Where do you think we're going to be in 100 years from now?
It's really interesting. I think there's several things that debates around that. First of all, the one that people always say to me is, will marriage die out completely? Because, you know, you see these drops in people marrying and the increase in divorce rates and all that kind of thing. And people have said to me, will marriage die out? I actually don't think marriage will die out because we are a really ritualistic species and we do like to have rules about where everybody is. And we like to have that social acknowledgement of a relationship. So I don't think marriage will ever die out. What I think might happen is the idea of being married for life. Because when marriage came about, you know, people lived a few decades. That was it. Now you can be in a marriage for 60, 70, 80 years. And that's a lot. And that's a lot of life to go through.
Yeah.
And still that person be the right person for you.
Totally.
So I think we might see a shift to more people having more than one marriage, or at least more than one long-term relationship. And I think things like polyamory and the open relationships, consensual non-monogamy, might become more acceptable in the way divorce has become more acceptable. Because people have always been polyamorous and people have always been in open relationships, but it's not something they've necessarily acknowledged publicly because it was seen as immoral. And I think there's starting to be that revolution, particularly with this younger generation who are much more open about sexuality and identity. I think we might have a drive more towards these are becoming more acceptable ways and being open about being polyamorous or in an open relationship or whatever it may be. I think that might become more open. I don't think, you know, loads and loads of people are suddenly going to become polyamorous. It's a very particular way of living. Which suits some people really well, but other people, you know, think it's the worst idea ever, and that's fine. You know, it depends on your levels of jealousy, for example. But I think we might become more open about things like that, and maybe less like judgmental about them. What
about ChatGPT, AI, people building these relationships with ChatGPT because it's answering the questions that they want, and then now their husband or wife is not talking to them the way that they want. And so, do you see that being a problem?
Yes, massive. I mean, that's the most terrifying thing on the horizon, really, for us in this field. Yeah. You know, AI is going to do lots of really great things for lots of people in terms of like medical diagnosis and you know, making lots and lots of things really easier, bureaucracy easier, wonderful. Where it really, I'm terrified of it treading is in our relationships. Because relationships aren't just about being with people. Relationships are integral to our health. We know the biggest factor in your mental and physical health, your longevity, your well-being, is the relationships you have in your life. So it's more powerful than not smoking, not being obese, you know, eating your vegetables, doing your exercise. Above all of those, the thing that's going to keep you going, keep you happy, keep you healthy, mentally and physically, are your relationships. And that's because of all that neurochemistry that's released, based on touch and based on, you know, being together and companionship and support and all those things that those relationships bring to you, whether they be romantic, friendships, family, whatever they might be. AI can't do that. I mean, the thing about AI is we've got all these terribly amazingly clever people focusing on it and focusing on the really cognitive bit of being human, which is, can it chat and can it sound like it's chatting like us? And And yes, that's important. But actually, what AI can't do is the absolute fundamental things that relationships need, which is touch, which is empathy. Empathy is very, very complex. No AI is anywhere near being able to empathize. Empathy takes a real acknowledgement and an understanding of how someone else is feeling. And that comes from life experience quite often. And AI doesn't have life experience. So even before that, we can't program that. It's terrifying, really, because we know that people who start relationships with ChatGPT or ChatGPT or chatbots, initially they feel better because they've got the dopamine hit of novelty. That's novelty. This is interesting and fun. Humans love fun, shiny new stuff, so I'm getting some dopamine. But over time, we know that people who have formed these relationships it impacts their mental health. They become increasingly depressed. They become increasingly lonely. They start to replace real relationships in their social network with the relationship they have with this AI. And that is detrimental because the relationships aren't just about chatting. They're about emotional support, practical support, as I've said, touch, all those physiological things which you need a wet brain and a wet body to be able to do. So it's terrifying because we are worried that we're going to kind of jump into it with both feet and not really stop and think the impact it's going to have. And the other thing that really worries is not just the ChatGPT side of things, which is terrifying. Because as you said, it's a really bad example of a relationship because when you chat to them, they just want to agree with you. They just, and we know that people particularly with chatbot boyfriends and girlfriends, it starts to evolve to meet your needs. It wants to be exactly, so it's the perfect boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, that's not realistic. And particularly for young people, if we think of the effect porn has had on young people's perceptions of sex, ChatGPT has the risk of doing the same for relationships. Relationships are not about being with someone who is always a yes person, who is always going to be perfect, who's never going to argue with you, who's never going to disagree with you. You're never going to have to compromise. You're never going to have to resolve an argument. Any of these things, because this thing is perfect for you. Well, that's completely unrealistic. And so if we teach young people that's what a relationship is, we're going to have a big problem because they're not going to have any of the skills. So it's scary. And then we get onto sort of robot carers and things like that. And the idea that granny would be cared for by a robot instead of a human, or heaven forbid your child will be raised by a robot nanny. And that's really terrifying. Because, caring is a very complex behaviour. It has lots of positive neurochemistry that goes along with it for both people involved. And if you replace that with a robot, none of that is there. And that is detrimental to that person's well-being.
We hear a lot about the loneliness epidemic that's going on now with people, especially men, being lonely. Where has this come from?
I think it's partly, the loneliness epidemic has partly come from people trying to maintain relationships at a distance on digital media, partly. So social media has its place, but people who try to spend a lot of time maintaining relationships in that way without actually ever really meeting their friends in person, again, because you're not getting any of the positive neurochemistry, which underpins your mental health, underpins your physical health, underpins your immune system, you start to get an increasing feeling of loneliness because you're not getting all the positive neurochemistry, you're not getting the touch, you're not getting the interaction. And that's why you start to feel lonely, is because you're not getting any of that. And then on top of that, I think for men in particular, that's a cultural thing partly, is that a lot of the loneliness comes from men not feeling they can share their vulnerabilities and that they can form relationships, particularly later in life. We're finding the phenomenon particularly amongst older men who maybe have retired or who maybe, are on their own for whatever reason. It's that confidence and that vulnerability to go out and make new friends. And we don't really teach our boys to do that, to be emotionally vulnerable, to be emotionally open to people, to forming new relationships. So it's partly we don't give men and boys the skills. Our model of masculinity, at least with the previous generations, has very much not been that. It's been about bottling everything up and not seeking help from anybody and not seeing those social connections as being a place of nurture or emotional support. I'm hoping we change that with the current generation and going forward, but that's what men have been taught is masculine. And that, I think, is why we have a particular crisis amongst men, is because we just not given them the opportunity to be vulnerable enough to make the relationships and to get from that relationship what you need to get from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Anna, we like to end our episodes with our guests sharing an object that is important to them. Is there an object that you have there that's important to you?
I do. It's here. It's so this, which is my dad's. My dad died 2 years ago. We're just coming up to the anniversary now. And my dad was an architect. And this is his pencil case. And in it, he's got all his stuff he used to use for drawing and pencils and all that kind of stuff. And it's really, really important to me because I miss him desperately every day. He was, even before I studied dads, now I look back at him as a dad and he was amazing. He definitely gave me incredible confidence, incredible resilience, definitely set me up for the world. I just like having things like this because this was the essence of who he was. He would carry it around every day and his hands touched it. And so it kind of keeps me close to him.
Did he ever give you a piece of advice that still sticks with you today?
He gave me 2 pieces of advice, one which is really silly, which sums him up, and one which I actually do carry with me. So the first piece of advice he gave me was never trust a man in brown suede shoes. And then the other thing he said to me was, if you're going through a really tough time, just remember that by this time next week or next month or next year, it will disappear. It's not significant. This too will pass. And I do rely on that now. When I'm having a really tough time, I think, actually, this is going to pass. And I'll look back on it and it will have seemed horrendous at the time. But actually, in hindsight, I survived it.
Yeah.
So that I do follow.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Anna. We really appreciate it.
And if someone's made it this far into the episode, they've loved every single word that you had to say. Is there something that you want to say to that person that is watching or listening to this episode today?
I think I would say to them, we're not great at necessarily nurturing our love relationships. We tend to think that certain ones are really, really important, like our romantic relationships, which they are. But I would say that there's no hierarchy of relationships where romantic love, for example, is at the top. That's just something we've been sold by the industry. Everyone, you need love in your life. It's really important for, as I've said, your well-being and your health and your longevity. But where you find that love, actually, it doesn't matter. So whether it's with a friend, with your family, with your community, with your football team, with your dog, with your God, none of that matters. The wonderful thing about being human is we have so many forms of love. So when I say to people who come up to me and say, but I don't have romantic love in my life, I don't have it, I go, well, actually, that doesn't really matter as much because it's not the most important one. It's not the most powerful one. So look at your life. Where's the love? And find that love and nurture it because that's really important.
Dr. Anna, thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing your knowledge on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna.